So we have 3 o'clock. We have 42 people here. 41 now. Somebody already left. I hope it was for Jeopardy.
Oh, sorry. Maybe it was romper room.
All right. So we only have 45 minutes. So I think we should probably get started right on time here. What do you think? We good? All right. So welcome to Scherl and Roth 101. We're going to take you through sort of the history of violin making. We're going to take you through some of our product, and we're going to use that product to talk about sound and how it makes a difference when you're playing. So please feel free to send out some questions if you have in the chat section. We'll send out a few polls and see where you're at. I'm going to send out a poll right now. This is about what you feel like you know about construction and how it impacts sound. So I'm going to send it out. I know we have a slight delay here. So I just sent it out. Wait about 7 seconds here, and you'll hear it probably. But we're going to talk a lot about how the instrument is constructed, and hopefully in a way that maybe you haven't thought about it before. So just as a quick background, I went to Arizona State. I was going to be a music educator, and I started, I wonder, actually, I think I have to push the publish. Oh, there we go. All right. Yeah, I need your help, Daryl, if I don't push the right button here. So I started as a music ed major, and I played violin for many years, and I was an all-state violin player, and I feel like I got fairly accomplished. But like if I look at these poll questions here, I knew almost nothing about my instrument. I could pick it up and I could tell you if I liked it, but I didn't know anything about it. And so as I got more into the industry, and I've now been in the industry almost 25 years, and as I've been in the industry, I've learned more and more, and I've spent time in China and all over the world looking at all these different instruments. And a lot of times when I would talk to educators, they didn't know the difference between a lot of the stuff. So they knew maybe the general terms, but not how it actually impacted the sound. And the easy thing was to say, everything impacts the sound. And that's true, but what things are most important, especially as an educator, and maybe as an educator with a high school orchestra or middle school or elementary school orchestra, what matters most to you, which might be a little different than if, for instance, you're playing with, somebody in the Chicago Symphony or something like that. They're going to have a totally different idea of what they're looking for versus what an educator might look for in a middle school or something. So we're going to kind of go over that stuff.
Well, or many of us played the instrument that we played because someone told us to play that instrument. I grew up in the private teaching and I came out with a master's degree in performance and didn't know anything about the woods that were made. I played the instruments that my teacher told me to buy. And then when you're in the schools and you are directly responsible for the instruments that are in the kids' hands, and you don't know about varnishes, you don't know about the different woods, well, this one's expensive and this one's not. Go for that one. Right. There's so much more information behind all of that.
Yep, absolutely. So let's start at the very beginning here. We're going to talk about kind of where it came from. So in the beginning, you had this VL, and there were instruments before this. I've had people say, well, why don't you go back? But this isn't necessarily a complete history lesson, so we're just going to hit a couple of these. But originally, the idea was that they had these instruments that allowed them to stroll around, your strolling strings types instruments. And for the most part, the VL was the major instrument that they would use in the 13th to the 15th century. It started to gain sort of this shape, and we went into sort of this Baroque violin, which had kind of this similar shape to a modern violin. So we have one here, very nice. So a lot of the differences in your Baroque violin was really the pressure that was put on the top. It's the angle, the neck angle, how tall the bridge is, the way the tailpiece is attached, all of those different kinds of things. The arching, I don't know if there's any way that you can show this where people can see it, but if you show the side of the instrument where the arch is, you can see that the arch is quite a bit.
I think that the things that are most noticeable, you'll notice the difference in the length of the fingerboard. You'll notice the lack of some of the things on like the accessories, chin rests and fine tuners. And then the projection of the neck is very different as well. So I play both instruments and I bring them into my students pretty frequently, at least once or twice a year, especially when working on Bach or Vivaldi.
Perfect. So I'm going to throw up a map here, and then I'm going to throw up another poll question, and hopefully I'll do this right this time. All right, so it looks like there's a lot of people who actually have at least some general knowledge here. I'm going to throw up the birthplace of the modern violin. All right, it's published. So in about 7 seconds, you've got about 15 seconds to answer this question. Let's see where everybody comes in at. Was it Romania, Cremona, Italy, Beijing, China? So far, everybody has answered Cremona, Italy. Are you sure about that? Are you sure? So yeah, actually, you're right. So Cremona is sort of the birthplace of the modern violin. It's very interesting when you look at where the influences came from. You see these influences from the east, from the west, from the north, and Cremona was almost like this sort of thoroughfare of where people would travel through, and this became that birthplace of that modern violin. So very good, everyone who answered that poll.
Side note to those of you who plan trips, if you do international trips, taking an orchestra to Cremona is like going to Mecca. It's really amazing.
And October is a good time if they are ever allowed to have the
international violin.
And then you can go and see a lot of these instruments. So these are your famous Cremonese families. These are the families that really are part of that modern violin making. So again, I'm going to throw up another poll here and let's see what we get. So we're going to talk about who is the father of the modern violin. So I'm going to get this poll out there. Let's see how we do. Who is the father of the modern violin? Was it Stradivarius or Guarneri del Gesù, Orville Gibson?
Who voted for Gibson? Walt, did you do that?
I think Walt did that. So the interesting thing is actually it's none of these three. So we typically attribute Stradivarius or Guarneri in some cases. We attribute the modern violin to those two makers. But actually, Nicola Amati is really considered to be the father of the modern violin. He was the one who gave it that more of its arching. If you look at Amati versus like a Strat, it has a very tall arch on it. And he kind of gave it more of its shape. So I kind of tricked you in this question here. And for those of you who picked Gibson, I think it might have been more Fender than Gibson. I don't know, but no. But the names Stradivarius and Guarneri are very important to us today because if you look at modern violin making, probably 95% of the violins that are made today are patterned after those two makers. Now, of course, people they copy Amatis and they copy other famous instruments, but in general, they're always Strads and Guarneris. In fact, Strad, every student instrument that you see out there for the most part will be a Strad. The Strad is the number one body that they'll use and when they make student instruments. And then Guarneri is the most popular after that. And then there's many others that they'll copy out. But generally, Strad and Guarneri are the two that we'll kind of focus on. So in this next slide, you'll see the first what we call modern violin. Again, there's a picture here of the older violin that has that short fingerboard. But Andrea Amati and Nicola Amati, Nicola was really, we call him the father of the modern violin because he's the one who mortised the neck into the upper block, for instance, instead of it being on the outside. Higher bridges and more tension, thicker tail guts, and longer, stronger bass bars. So basically, he created it so that it could take more tension than what the older violins could take. But interestingly enough, Andrea Amati actually created sort of the first violin, if you want to say, for Catherine de Medici, and actually she ordered an entire orchestra worth in 1560. So it's kind of interesting. Again, a little bit of that history. So we'll just keep moving through this. So I think I have another poll question here on this one. So we'll give everyone a chance. The question on this one is, which one is the Strad? Is the Strad on the right or is the Strad on the left? Let's see. Actually, you know what? I forgot to put out that poll question. I forgot to write it up. I meant to write it up, but I think I didn't do that. So
we'll put it in the chat.
There we go. Yeah, put it in the chat. What do you guys think? Is it on the right or is it on the left?
Which one? Strad?
Strad is on the right or on the left? And this one isn't a trick question, Arlene. So this one, if you think you know, which one is it, right or left?
Excellent. The first one was left and the second one said right.
Ashley said right. Chris said left. Joshua said left. All right. David right.
Clazel.
So your Strad is on the right. Actually, your Guarneri is on the left. Interestingly enough. So you can kind of see a little bit by the F holes that you'll see in the shape as you look at the waist here, these C bouts, and you look at the lower bouts, you can see the difference. It's a little hard to see on the screen. When Arda says your right or my left, I think we're looking at the same screen, the same way, I believe. It's the violin underneath the Guarneri. That's actually the Strad. I kind of flipped those just to be a little tricky. But that one is your Strad. Your Guarneri is on the left here. So you can see the waist difference here versus the waist difference here, and then these lower bouts here and here. Guarneri was actually known for these nubby corners. Not quite sure why, but a lot of his instruments had these little nubby corners. So, okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about Strad and Tertis. Now, if you haven't heard of Tertis, Tertis is a type of viola. He was a viola player who had this odd-shaped viola made for him. So I had trouble finding a picture of a Strad viola, original Strad viola. So I just, it's very similar to a violin shape. So I used this Strad violin picture here. On your left is your Tertis. If you notice that in the lower bouts here, I think, can you see my mouse as I move it around?
Mm-mm.
No?
Nope.
Okay, so I'm just using my mouse for my own purposes. But if you look at the lower bouts here, you'll see that those lower bouts are much wider than the upper bouts, and the upper bouts being the shoulders of the instrument and the lower bouts being those hips of the instrument underneath the C bouts. You'll see it's a very hippie viola, right? It's got these big wide hips, and basically what it does is it gives you about a half an inch bigger in sound than the size of the viola, which I always say is fantastic for those smaller viola players, those viola players who, it seemed like when I was growing up, all of the best viola players were like 5'3". I don't know why, but they were always your really great viola players. I studied with a professor named William Majors, Dr. Majors at Arizona State when I was in like 8th grade. And I studied with him throughout high school, and all of his students, he was a viola teacher at ASU, even though he taught violin, and all of his students were really tiny. And this particular viola is fantastic for those little viola players who want a bigger sound, but don't necessarily want that 17-inch length. So really nice. I don't know.
Well, and I'll chime in there. Can I chime in real quick with
Absolutely.
we tell our students about the violin family, where you have the violin, the length of the violin, and then the length of a cello. If you consider proportionally the length of a viola should actually be 2 to 3 inches longer than it ever can be because of the length of our arm. So any advantage we can get in a viola where there's more square footage for the resonance cavity is what we're looking for in a viola, as opposed to just simply a smaller viola, but you're a fifth lower than a violin.
Right, absolutely, as well. And we talk about, coming from like a viola da gamba, which is really, obviously much bigger, played much different, played more in the lap than almost like a cello. This is that shorter version of that, and that Tertis model is a great model. So Ardeth actually talks about a Gasparo da Salo as well, and which is also a great model. I kind of keep it to these simply because there are a bunch of great models out there. Most modern manufacturers will make a Tertis model viola. And so when you're working with your students, I always suggest this one because whether it's us or whether it's a number of the other manufacturers out there, the modern manufacturers, they'll make a Tertis version of their violas. Typically not in the student model, but in some of the higher level models, they'll make a Tertis model. Okay, so then we have Strad versus Montagnana. So Strad is again, hopefully, as you're looking at it, it's on the left. It's underneath the Strad, and Montagnana is kind of underneath the Montagnana there. You'll see the Montagnana has those big, broad shoulders. And I say this is the Montagnana cello is kind of like the opposite of the Tertis viola, where the tertis viola is for sort of your smaller cello player or your viola player. Your tertis is a big, broad shoulder and typically suits a larger cello player, but has this big, bold sound. And I always like to say, if you've got a good high school orchestra, if you don't have one or two of these in your orchestra, I would suggest getting a couple, spending some of your funds as you're looking at new cellos on getting a couple of these Montagnana models. You'll see a bigger, bolder sound in there, and you'll see the sound of your orchestra will just it just adds a lot of volume and depth to that sound of your cello section. So,
hey John, Rachel asked a question back on the viola tertis model. She says, when did this tertis model start being made? Is it a new thing?
So as far as a new thing, to be honest with you, I'm not sure when it was first designed. I have to go back. I think Ardith put a Wikipedia about Lionel Tertis on there. But for as long as I've been in the industry, so at least the 25 years that I've been here, tertis has always been not by, I would say, your traditional, like Scherl and Roth has never had a tertis model until I came to the company. But your other manufacturers, like your Eastman Strings and your Maple Leaf Violins and these other manufacturers, they've been making them for quite some time. So it's been around for quite a while, but not necessarily by every manufacturer. So by Scherl and Roth, we've had it now for just a couple of years. So, all right, we're going to keep going here. I'm going to talk just quickly, a brief history about Scherl and Roth and Glaisel. So what a lot of people don't realize is that Glaisel and Scherl and Roth, the first violin makers, they were actually born around the time that Stradivarius and Guarneri were still alive. So the Roth family, the Glaisel family actually go back for hundreds of years. It's actually pretty cool. But as we kind of fast forward and we look at where Heinrich Roth was, the Heinrich Roth moved to the United States. There's actually still an Ernst Heinrich Roth in Germany. They still make violins today. But Ernst Heinrich Roth in the 1920s, his son moved to the United States, and that was Heinrich Roth. And in 1932, he teamed up with Max Scherl, and they purchased Simpson and Frey, and they basically created Scherl and Roth. And Scherl and Roth then moved from New York to Cleveland and had a few changes in it. And then Kurt Glaisel started working for Scherl and Roth. So it's so interesting. You have these sort of companies that sort of all kind of come from each other, even though they were Glaisel violin makers even before, the first Glaisel violin maker was born before the first Scherl and Roth maker. They actually worked for each other here in the United States. And then switch this here and you'll see that in 1973, Roth actually retired. And at that time, Glaisel went out on his own and made his own shop. Then in 1977, he joined the Selmer company. Roth joined the UMI company, or was a part of Conn and UMI in that. And then Conn-Selmer, UMI and Selmer merged together in 2000, created UMI. And so that was sort of this history of how the Scherl and Roth company sort of came to be. And then in 2017 is when I joined the company, and we actually relaunched it. So it came out with a little more updated logo and some new instruments and some different types of instruments that we hadn't had before. So just a quick information about where we came from. So Grant had a question here. Do I simply say to my local retailer that I want to invest in a Montagnana cello? That doesn't seem like a model they'd have in stock. Your average school music dealer, I would say, wouldn't have that in stock. If you have a school music dealer who has a violin shop within the store, like for instance, your Quinlan and Fabish, for instance, where they have Lloyd Palmer, who's a fantastic strings person, knows all about instruments and has a string shop within their store, you'll see that they would probably carry that instrument. A lot of your other school music dealers may not, but they can certainly get them. So for instance, the Music and Arts, if you do business with Music and Arts, they can certainly get a Montagnana from us or any other manufacturer. We carry them in stock. Most of the other manufacturers carry them in stock, and it's something you can get for you easily. So definitely something that you just want to ask for. Okay, so in the modern history, we kind of fast forward past World War II and this mechanization of string instrument making, and it's interesting to note that this picture of this machine that we have here that's making scrolls, this came out of World War II. So there was all these machinery that they could start building. You're welcome, Grant. There's all these the building of instruments that went from just this cottage industry. Originally went from one person, and he had an apprentice, and then Ernst Heinrich Roth really started to create this. He's almost like the Ford of the violin industry, where he created this cottage industry where you had one family making tops and one family making backs and one family making ribs, and they would sell these parts to Ernst Heinrich Roth, and then he'd put them together in an instrument. Well, then after that, it started to go to this mechanization. And this picture that you see is actually a German machine that was eventually moved to China, and it was owned by Kurt Glasel, and he brought it over there when they started building instruments in China. So it's interesting when you see where instruments are made today. Some of your best instruments are made in China today, even though there's still a lot of instruments made in Romania and Germany and other places. Some of your very best instruments for the money are made in China. We've tried to stay away from this mechanization for the most part. Companies like us, and again, many of the other companies, for the most part, have stayed away from mechanization, except for scrolls, because scrolls are in a place where you don't do tap tuning. You don't take an instrument, tap the top, and listen to it and see what pitch it is, and have to customize each top to the wood that it's made from. You can just build a scroll as long as it has the dimensions. If you want to put in whatever those dimensions are into the computer, and it'll actually make a scroll. So a lot of your inexpensive violins, your student violins, our student violins, for instance, all of our scrolls on our student violins are made like this. But our tops are handcrafted, our ribs are handcrafted, and I'll show you some pictures of those. Feel free to add anything in that you want as we go through here, Daryl.
Fantastic information.
So I'm going to just hit a couple of things here. So we talk about top plates and back plates. We always know the top and the back, right? And we hopefully you know all of these other things. You know the fingerboard and the neck and the sound post and the bass bar. Maybe some of you haven't looked inside a violin to actually see how a bass bar is put in. But that bass bar, that's that bar that runs along the top, or along the top of the instrument, about 3/4 of the length of the instrument, and it's on the bass side of the instrument. That's why they call it the bass bar. And you can see how it's put in there. And what they do is when they put that in, they actually they carve out the ends of it, the little wings of it, and they actually press it into the top. And I know it's hard to see with my fingers here, but they press it down and they clamp it down. You don't want a lot of tension on that, but you have to have a little tension on it, just a tiny bit of tension on it. It's what creates that rigidity in the top. And that bass bar, I would say, is probably the hardest thing of building an instrument, for instance. But when we talk about top plates,
quickly, I was just going to say that this is what you're seeing here. If any of you are teaching in a school and you haven't already exploded one of your dead instruments to have this available for your students, it's an invaluable teaching tool, especially that bass bar. If you teach the kids how to look through the F-hole and to see the sound posts on one side and the bass bar on the other side, they don't know what they're looking at unless they see something exactly like this. And I know a picture is worth 1,000 words, but we all have that instrument that died somewhere along the way. And if you can get this exact, we have a cello version of this sitting in our classroom all the time. So it's just great for question and answer. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's great. And I always say it's kind of hard for everyone to hear me on this, but if we were live, if I kind of held my nose a little bit and talk like this, and then just opened it up and talk like this, you can hear the resonation difference, right? And that bass bar, that impacts that resonance of the instrument so much. If this bass bar is put in too tight, or if it's too thick, you get that very tight sound that doesn't want to project. And when you replace the bass bar or you open it up, all of a sudden you just have so much more resonation. So really, it's something that you definitely, it's not a lot that you can do with the bass bar, but if you get a brand new instrument and it sounds extremely nasally like that, try adjusting the sound post. There might be too much tension there. Try making sure that the tailpiece is the right length or in the right position. So different things like that. Check. I'll show you some neck angles. You'll want to check that kind of thing. But if all of that is right and everything is working and it still has that really nasally sound, a lot of times it's because that bass bar has been put in too tight. And you may want to take it back and get a different one.
Or there are some places that will sell a violin with no bass bar. You can, or a viola, or a cello. You can actually look for it. And when it doesn't sound good and it looks like the whole thing's glued together, and you go, there's no bass bar.
Yep. That has happened.
That has happened.
So we're gonna quickly go through these. I know I only have 45 minutes and I'm running out of time quickly. So we're gonna go through just a couple of these different parts of the instrument, and then we're gonna hit some of our models here. So I just wanted to show you some shapes. So this is how the instrument actually takes shape. If you've never seen a violin being built, I think it's always very invaluable for you to see the start of a violin and how do they actually put the ribs together. So that the first thing they do is they use this mold, and they actually put this they put the violin on this mold, and they put the ribs together. They put the blocks in. So you'll see there's a block in the upper and lower bout, and then both into the corner blocks as well. So again, just a quick idea to see how it sort of takes shape. Then when you talk tops and backs, there's, we always talk about the wood and how the wood makes a difference. And we look at one-piece backs versus two-piece backs. And I like this picture because you'll see where it says there are two halves of a violin top. That's the same thing on a back. So they call that quarter cutting. So if it's a two-piece back, it's been quarter cut like that. If it's slab cut, that's when you get a one-piece back. So you can see these different styles of, and you would actually graduate the backs differently and graduate the tops differently. And this gives you a little bit of idea of what you're looking for when you're looking at instruments. Obviously, we want the wood to be aged over 5 years. We want generally about 1 millimeter of ring spacing between. And when you look at the instrument, actually, if you look down the center of the instrument, we want that grain to be very narrow. And then as it works its way out towards the edges, we want it to just increase slightly. And we want it to increase evenly. That means that tree basically had sort of an even weather pattern throughout its life, and you tend to get the best resonance out of a top like that. Okay.
I just wanted to, you used a word graduated, and my son just graduated, but that's not the kind of graduated that we're talking about. The graduation that you're talking about is the thickness of the actual wood along.
That's right.
Like from the side angle part of it.
So you can actually see what he's doing here, which is shaping the top, but this is also a way that you graduate that wood. So what they will do is they'll actually change the thickness. So in the center, if you look at the violin that's on the side here, and you look where the bridge is at, just down below the bridge towards the F hole in this area, a lot of times modern instruments, a lot of the violin instruments, the Chinese instruments, they'll actually carve these down to about 2.8 to 3.1 millimeters in that range, where in a lot of your older German and Romanian instruments, they'll actually be as high as 3.5 to 3.8. So much thicker in this area. And it's just basically, I like to say that the thinner you make it, it's almost like artificially aging the instrument. It opens up the instrument. It makes it sound older. The problem is if you go too thin on it, the life of the instrument after 5 years just kind of crashes. And so for a while there, about probably 15 years ago, a little more than that, you used to see these really graduated instruments, and they sounded fantastic. And then all of a sudden, about 5 years later, it just was. The sound got worse and worse instead of better and better. And a lot of those old German instruments would get better and better and better. So over time, you've seen a lot of the Chinese makers who have actually changed their techniques, and they have much more German-like graduations than what they had for a while. So I just want to hit a couple of these questions. Ardath, we don't have a poster of that, but as Daryl said, I think it's a great idea. We'll get working on a poster, and you'll have a poster. Rachel, how do they replace fixed bass bars? Do they take the whole top off? Yeah, you actually take the whole top off. And if your students have a bad buzz and you can't figure out where it's from, typically the bad buzz is coming from a seam opening, which is around the edges of the top or the back. That's normally where your buzz is coming from. But if it's not loose, if there's not an opening there, if it's a modern violin, check the F holes. A lot of times I've found buzzing, and many, many times where I couldn't find where the buzzing is, if it's a modern violin, on the top of the F hole. So especially for some reason, it happens mostly on the treble side of the instrument. If you're looking at the F hole, at the top F hole, where it just starts to arch over, a lot of times you have a little piece of varnish, and the varnish has come together just slightly like this, but it's not connected, and it actually buzzes. And I don't know how many times I've seen that, and it's just people are going crazy because they can't find a buzz on this instrument, and it's this little tiny piece of varnish, and if you just nick it out and cut that piece out, all of a sudden the buzz goes away magically, and it's much better than pulling a top and looking to see if the bass bar is loose or something like that.
Well, and all the other bars, I would say all the other buzz, all the other buzz detection too, where the chin rest is hitting the tailpiece and in the pegs and the peg box, and once you've eliminated all those various different buzzes, then it can be bass bar. But I've actually never had bass bar be the issue. It's always been something else identifiable.
That's right. Typically, your bass bars will be put in too tight, not too loose. So they'll either not be put in at all, or they're they're put in way too tight. So. And Rachel, yeah, definitely. If it's an inexpensive instrument, your cost of pulling the top and repairing a bass bar, not even worth it. We don't even do that to ours. If we find that one is, if we find one here, we'll actually just set the instrument aside and someday either get to it or maybe donate it or chuck it or whatever. So it's just not worth pulling the top on it. So, okay. So Maddie has some favorite sizing resources, websites, or videos. Honestly, I think that's a great question for Daryl. Do you have any resources on sizing?
I'm a high school, but I know my middle school directors have the old yardstick, and it's got, we got them at conventions for years and years and years. So I think there's a lot of resources available online. Definitely check Asta Strings and
agree with that. Yeah, one of the things I would say when you're sizing, I see people do it all the time. They size only based on length. So they'll stretch the hand as far as they can. And sometimes with your children that have very narrow shoulder widths, all of a sudden they have this violin that they might be able to reach, but it looks enormous on them. So when I size someone, I always try to not only look at the length of the instrument, but the width of the instrument. And I would tend to actually go down a little bit to meet the width difference so that it's not so big in their hands. They can always get bigger. They can always go to a full-size violin or something later as they get there. But I like to make sure that I check this distance here to make sure that they can actually get around the instrument. So Ardath said that it makes a little cardboard cutouts. I think that's a great idea as well. So, all right, we're going to keep going here. Purfling. Now, purfling, a lot of people think that purfling is for the look of the instrument. Sometimes it has double purfling on, especially your older instruments. And double purfling, generally, yes, that's for the look of the instrument. But the single purfling, the original purfling that they put on there, that is absolutely structural to an instrument. And it's very important when you look at the purfling, that especially if you're doing a school bid and you're sending it out, if your school district says, no, we have to go to public bid, for instance, there are certain terminology that you want to use in that bid. And one of the terminology that we want to use here is inlaid purfling. Inlaid. It's very important that you use the term inlaid because it means that it's not painted on. And in your very inexpensive instruments, they'll just paint it on. Now, there is a certain circumstance where us and Eastman and like I said, Maple Leaf and Howard Core and all the other companies, we do paint on purfling. We paint on purfling when it's a laminated instrument. There's no reason for the purfling if it's laminated. So that the purfling is there in case you bump the side of it. It stops the crack from going up through the top. Okay, it's a structural part that allows that crack to just hit the side of it. And you know all those old Roth violins from the 70s and 80s that are still out there that have they're just beat all the heck on the bottom of them, right? And they don't have cracks going up through the top. Well, that's because of this purfling that's been put into the instrument. On a laminated instrument, the grain will go this direction and the other grain will go this direction. And the crack always wants to travel the length of the grain. So when the crack is going down and it actually hits this vertical piece, it typically will stop that and you end up getting chipping instead of cracking. And because of that, that's why you don't put, there's no reason to actually carve in purfling on a laminated instrument because it's the lamination itself is what is built in to stop that cracking. And we'll talk a little bit about laminated versus carved instruments and that kind of thing.
And I was just going to add that talking to your kids about purfling can be the funnest exploration of all, because it's actually 3 pieces of wood and it's not inlaid all the way through to the bottom. It's just carved in a little channel. And if you can find one of those, how this is made, and show them about purfling, I just love, that's just usually a mind blow for the kids. And then they're looking at their instruments and they're trying to figure out if it's drawn or inlaid. Great exploration.
Yep, definitely. I think it's a fun thing to do. So scrolls, again, scrolls are one of these things where we typically copy. If we're making a Strad, we copy a Strad scroll. If we're making Guarneri, we copy a Guarneri scroll. We don't, it's considered to be sort of the maker's mark, but we just copy. It's not necessarily, like, we wouldn't make our own scroll because it's a Scherl and Roth instrument. We would copy the scroll on there. So now the one thing to think about is a lot of your old Strads today, all the necks have been replaced. They're not original necks because the necks were too short. And if you wanted to play Mozart's Fifth Violin Concerto, you'd have to go up past where it would actually play. So they started putting new necks on there. The last time I did some research, and it might be different now, but the last time I did some research, there were only about eight instruments out there that people knew of that actually had original necks. All the other necks have been replaced on them. So, okay. Let's talk varnish. There's 3 different types of varnishes generally that you have to be aware of, and these days there's actually a 4th. So the first type of varnish is what we call a nitrocellulose lacquer. They use it on guitar making a lot. They use it a lot in the 70s and 80s and 90s. It's very protective. It's a lacquer that just goes right over the top and helps protect it. Then you have a spirit varnish, and spirit is just like what it sounds like. It's an alcohol-based varnish. And it dries very quickly. It's a great varnish that allows the wood to vibrate. And then you have an oil varnish. The oil varnish can take 3 months to dry long enough, at least 6 weeks, but sometimes up to 3 months to dry long enough in order to ship the instrument. So if we make an instrument with an oil varnish, we have to let it dry before we can even ship it. Then it takes about a year plus for it to actually cure and continue to harden. And you'll see with a new instrument that has an oil varnish, it'll actually open up. The sound will open up as over that year as that instrument, as that varnish kind of cures. And yes, it does have somewhat to do to the wood vibrating as well. But we've done tests where we've taken a violin and we've varnished it, and then we just let it sit, and then we play it, and then we let it sit some more, and then we play it. So we don't actually keep playing it, and it continues to sound better over time just with that varnish as it's curing. So that's your oil varnish. The 4th type is what we call a hybrid varnish. And these days we're actually using a lot of hybrid varnishes. We don't actually use a straight lacquer varnish on any of our instruments. What we do is we mix a spirit and a lacquer together. So it's got basically different coats, and that spirit and then that little bit of lacquer allows us to put a nice varnish on it that makes the instrument sound good, and then a very thin coat of lacquer instead of a thick coat of lacquer that helps protect the wood. So all of our student instruments have that hybrid varnish instead of a straight a spirit or a straight lacquer varnish.
So am I assuming that you don't sell any pink violins or black cellos, right?
We don't sell any pink instruments. No. I mean, I know that there's some kids out there that love them, but unfortunately we're still a traditional company, and we like to make instruments that sound good still. So
darn it.
We don't do that. Now, the final thing is the setup. The setup is so important that this is why you buy it from wherever you buy it. And this is why I don't sell you violins direct, because I set them up here and we check certain measurements, but then we send them to Chicago in the wintertime, or we send them to a dealer in Florida, in the summertime, or all these different places. And your local dealers, they're the ones who actually set that instrument up for you. That's why you go to that local dealer. The local dealer is so important for understanding what your area needs and how to set up your instrument. But there are some things that you should take a look at. We talk about the violin mensur. The mensur is actually where the bridge goes. We always say it's the notches where the notches are. That's where you put the violin on, or the bridge on there. But actually, I've seen some instruments where they didn't carve the F holes in the right place, and that's not actually where the bridge goes. So the mensur, it's a 2 to 3 ratio. If you measure from the nut to the neck, or to the body of the instrument, to the heel, and you divide that in half and then multiply it by 3, you should come up with about 19.5 centimeters. That's where the bridge goes. So what you do is you take that neck area, you divide it in half, and you multiply it by 3, and then you go from where that end measurement was, where the body of the instrument is, and that's where those 3 sections come, and that's where the bridge goes to. So again, from the nut to the instrument, divide it in half, multiply it by 3, and then that calculation goes from the body of the instrument to where the bridge goes. That's your mensur. And I have some ratios on here for violin, violoncello, and bass. You can kind of check those. You also want to check string height. Make sure that your string height is in the right place. A lot of teachers will look at it and they'll say, oh, my string height isn't correct. But what's actually happened is the neck angle has changed, right? And you want to see if that, because if the neck angle's changed and your weather has recently changed and you change your bridge, all of a sudden then when the weather changes again and your neck angle changes again, all of a sudden you've got the wrong bridge again.
Can also be the belly of the instrument has sunk or
well, you hope not.
Too.
You hope that
right.
that hasn't happened. If that happens, you definitely have that it's a bigger issue. So we do have this in a handout. In fact, they gave me all these different things to do. There's a couple of things here. I'm going to start an offer here for this training packet that I've put together for you. And then I also have a file here. Oh, no, my file's gone. I will make sure that everybody gets the file, this in a PowerPoint as well. But it should be, a lot of the information that we're going over today will also be in that packet that I just sent out in the offer. So I guess on this slide, what I really wanted you to know is I want you to make sure that you understand that you have to check not only the bridge height, but you have to check the neck angle as well. Okay. All right. A couple of useful tools. If you are a teacher and you don't have a ruler, buy a millimeter ruler. They're cheap. You can get them on Amazon. Definitely buy one. And if you don't have this useful measurements for violin makers, man, I tell you, Strobel probably, I don't know him real well, but he probably doesn't realize this, but I tell
he had a little shop in Monmouth, Oregon, about 20 minutes away from my high school where I taught for 6 years. Amazing, amazing man. And this is an invaluable resource.
It really is. And it's not very expensive. And quite frankly, it's got everything you want to know, probably a bunch of stuff you don't want to know, but as far as measurements and what they should be, get this book and it'll help you. It's absolutely fantastic. All right. I'm already running out of time here. I've talked too long. So parts of the bridge here. So everybody may not know this, but this is definitely a fun thing to do here. Quiz your kids on this. This middle section here, right above the logo, this is your heart. And then these 2 holes on either side, these are your kidneys, right? Then you have the ankles right above the feet. You have the arch on top. So learn these different parts of it and think about these different parts as they're actually parts that they're like your highs and your lows and your mids as you're dialing in the sound of an instrument. You'll actually carve these parts out. A great hand carved bridge will have these parts carved out of them. We don't do that. We generally, we carve them. We put a little bit of work into them, but we don't carve each instrument to each bridge. But that's what your local dealer will do. That's why you want to buy it from a local dealer. And then multiple different types of tailpiece and all this. I like to address this. A lot of people say you must have a wood tailpiece with 4 fine tuners instead of this Whitner style tailpiece. You want to make sure that if you buy this type of tailpiece with the integrated fine tuners, that you buy a real German Whitner tailpiece. If you buy a Chinese knockoff, there are actually some decent Chinese ones out there, but generally the screws strip, you can't back them out. You can't fix one screw. With the Whitners, you can. We use them on all of our student ones because those fine tuners are integrated. So instead of having the string length shortened at the end of the tailpiece, we integrate it into the tailpiece so that you have the natural after length. That length between the bridge and the tailpiece is actually still natural in using that tailpiece. You get a better sound using that tailpiece. That's why that was developed. Now, Jose has a question on fixed feet versus rotating feet. Rotating feet are great if you need to slap something on real quick. But I definitely wouldn't use one of those if you could take one in to get it fitted. But having a few of those bridges with the rotating feet and different, they make them in small, medium, and high. Having those on hand in case 2 minutes before you go out on stage and somebody's bridge breaks, throw it on there, get them through the concert, and it helps you. We do sell those, and other people sell those. I think they're great in a last minute pinch, but I wouldn't use it as my regular bridge. So I think you'll lose a lot of tonal qualities if you do that. Okay, we are out of time. And I haven't even got through our product structure yet. I don't really care about all that just because I really wanted to get through the first part of this and get you sort of this history and some of these ideas that you wanted. I'll let you guys go through the packet. I'll send this out to everyone so you'll have it. That talks about our instruments and the different product structures and shows you a couple of these. I'm just going to go through these slides real quick. Hopefully there's not another thing you have to jump to at 3:45, but you can leave.
No, it's they're all coming to 21st century successful string programs, right?
Fantastic.
That's the next one.
Okay, so we have these different instruments. We have laminated tops, and we also have hybrid tops or hybrid instruments, which has a carved top and a laminated. Your fully laminate is very durable. It's a great rental instrument. It's that instrument that if you are in a place where your kids are beating up the instruments, number one, teach your kids not to beat them up. But number two, if you need to, getting a fully laminated instrument is an option. I always recommend, if you can, buy an instrument that is hybrid, a carved top, laminated back and sides. And when you're in a place like Chicago, especially, that has a lot of weather changes, those hybrid instruments are great for middle schools, elementary schools. I wouldn't necessarily use them for a high school, but they really are good. If you want something like our fully carved cello, I'm going to just get to our 50 series cello here. I always give this warning. If you want a fully carved instrument and you want it for a low price, you're going to have to choose. Do you want a low price or do you want a fully carved cello? If you buy them both, which we make, you're probably going to see seam openings in the first year or two. So expect that. If you buy an inexpensive, fully carved instrument that's all carved, no lamination, and you live in a place like Salt Lake or Chicago or these places that get really dry in the wintertime, expect your seams to open. Now, that instrument will adjust over time, and after the first year or two, as it goes through its seasonality, it'll probably be fine after that. It should be fine after that. But just know that you may have some seam openings in the beginning, and you may have to work through that. If you expect that it won't be a problem, you'll probably be disappointed.
Hopefully you have a good repair budget. Hey, what about, right. You have a question in here about like the perfection pegs.
Right.
Sort of
yeah, so there are two types.
What's the current?
Yeah, there are two types of pegs. There's perfection pegs, and then Whitner also makes a peg, a mechanical peg as well. Those are the two that I recommend. We don't actually use any of those on our instruments simply because the cost of putting them in and the variability of who wants them, who doesn't. They're not popular enough in the marketplace. Are you traditional and what? So we just use traditional friction pegs, but they are out there, and you can also retrofit them. So either the perfection pegs or the other pegs, you can certainly retrofit. For Jessica, when I define inexpensive, if you want a cello under $2,000, fully carved cello under $2,000, generally expect, or if you're going to be in that $1,500 range, expect that you're going to see seam openings in the first year or two. If you're spending $400 or $500
$200 to $300 of repair every year.
Yeah, you're going to spend a little bit of that money on that because the wood just isn't aged long enough. Think about it as an investment. If you put your money in the bank, you're going to want more from that money a year or two later than you do right now. And the same thing is for wood. The longer you age the wood, the more expensive it gets. Okay, couple other things here. I'm just going to fly through these slides. And we're almost there, I promise. Daryl was teasing me earlier because I had so many slides. But I'd like you to have the information, even if we don't talk about it all. I'd like you to at least have a lot of that information. Understanding Tort. I had another question. We're late, so I'm not going to throw this out there, but the father of the modern bow is Francois Tort. He actually created this sort of concave shape. I know you have a bow there, right? You want to show them your most people should know and see the difference.
I have my Baroque bow here, and then this is my beautiful Sartori version.
So these are the Francois Tour. I throw him in there because you should know that he's the father of the modern bow. Every string teacher should know who the father of the modern products that they talk about, even though it's way back in the 1700s. He's the father of the modern bow. Picot, it's this hatchet head that you see up here. It's this very angular head, and Sartori is probably 85% of the bows that you're going to see out there. Those Picot and Sartori are what you're going to see most of the time, and they have different feels to them. Yeah, you can see there's a Picot head. That's that hatchet style head there.
Yep.
So, and some people call it the tip. Bowmaker would call it the head. They'd call the very tip of it the nose, and then the sides of it are the cheeks, and that top, the angular part, that's the forehead. So just understanding some of these styles and knowing as you look at them, as you pick out your bow, seeing, oh, this is a Picot head or this is a Sartori head. It does make a difference in feel, so you may want to look at those things. Sartori generally is the most reliable, most consistent type of head out there.
Great stories with Tort and Paganini too, so if you want to have some fun stories for your kids.
Okay, so typically you've got braided carbon Brazil wood, Pernambuco. There was a question, Daryl had a question about fiberglass. We don't actually sell a fiberglass bow because these days fiberglass is such a terrible thing to work with that a lot of Chinese makers on the inexpensive bows, they don't want to use it. So they actually, even though the material is cheaper than carbon, they charge more for the labor. So if we found that it's maybe $1.50 more for us to manufacture a carbon bow versus a fiberglass bow. So we just do that. We don't actually offer a fiberglass bow. There are fiberglass bows out there. They tend to be, they don't respond as well. They tend to be just, they sort of sit on the string and they're just there. They don't have a nice camber to them and react to the player. But I do think that it's something that if you are looking and you're looking for a bow for your class, you should be able to find an inexpensive carbon bow for not much more than a fiberglass. So I would recommend that you look for that versus a fiberglass bow. And then different cases, you can always look at those and bags, and that is pretty much the presentation. So I know there's a ton of information in there. I got a lot of questions about. It sounds like I have some posters I need to make for you, which I will work on. I know there's a lot in there that we didn't go over. If you have questions, please feel free to ask me. I know that Daryl has to jump off. She has another one coming up here in about 3 minutes or so.
Okay.
Please feel free. I'm just going to, I'm going to put in the comments here my email address. I can type.
I'm going to hop off.
Okay,
thank you, Daryl. John. Thanks for all your amazing work.
Yeah.
It was great to be on.
See ya. So I put my email address on there. If you'd like, please take it and feel free to send me an email anytime you'd like. So appreciate everybody being on. Have a great time at Conn-Selmer Institute Connect, and we will see you next time.